In today's lesson, we're going to talk about the properties of real numbers. Don't get scared by the real numbers. It's simply a name that is given to the group of numbers that we have already been working with up to this point. The first set that I want to talk about are called the addition properties of real numbers because, like the name suggests, they're all addition. The very first one is called the commutative property of addition, and it looks something like this. 6 plus 2 equals 2 plus 6. So what does that mean? Well, it simply means that when you're going to add two numbers together, you can add them in any order that you want, and you will still get the same thing. If I have 6 hats and I add 2 hats, I have 8 hats. If I have 2 hats and I add 6 hats, I have 8 hats. So the order is not important. The second property is called the associative property of addition, and it has more than 2 numbers. And you'll notice that the 7 plus 9 is grouped together. So we have 3 plus, in parentheses, is 7 plus 9. But you could group it in any way that you wanted to. If we wanted to group the 3 plus the 7 first and then add the 9, we're still going to end up with the same number in the end. The additive identity property. Now the identity property in this case, if I add 7 plus 0, again, it doesn't matter what the order is, it still is going to equal 7 because 7 plus 0 is just 7. And that actually makes sense to us. Inverse property of addition, also known as the additive inverse. I actually prefer the additive inverse name because it's shorter. And I told you sometimes mathematicians can be a little lazy. Well, this one looks like 3 plus negative 3 is the same as negative 3 plus 3, and they both will give you 0. Now, this positive and a negative, if you go back to our integers when we discussed positive and negative, that makes sense as well. Multiplication properties of numbers is the other set that we're going to talk about as far as the real properties. Commutative property of multiplication. Similar. There are 2 terms that we are multiplying together. Now notice if we multiply 4 times 5, you know from your multiplication tables that that equals 20. It's the same as if you took 5 times 4, you would still end up with 20. The associative property of multiplication means that we could have more than 2 numbers, and we could take this 2 times 6, multiply them together, and then multiply by 3. It would be the same thing as if we took 6 times 3 in a parentheses and multiplied the 2 times 6 times 3. They will both give you the same result, which in this case is 36. The identity property of multiplication, or as I like to use, the multiplicative identity property, is simply says if you take a number and multiply it by 1, you will end up with that number. So 8 times 1 will always give you 8. Or 6 times 1 will give you 6. Or negative 5 times 1 will give you negative 5. The inverse property of multiplication, or the multiplicative inverse, says that if we take 5 times, its inverse is simply you take the 5 and you put it in a fraction on the bottom. So 1 over 5. And we're going to deal with that more on fractions, but for now, you can just use this rule. So 5 times 1 over 5 is equal to 1. That was a positive number. Now how about a negative number? Now you notice the negative is out front, and that is simply proper form. So both have to be negative, and if we multiply negative 2 times its inverse, which is negative 1 over 2, we will still get a 1. The multiplication property of 0, which is our last property, is any number times 0 is going to give you 0. So 7 times 0 equals 0. So what number should replace this question mark, and how do you know? If we have negative 4 times 1 over what number will give me 1, the only number it can be is a negative 4. And the reason we know that is because of our multiplicative inverse property. How about 9 times 3 is equal to what number times 9? Well, if these are going to be equal, we know that our number has to be 3, and that is because of the commutative property of multiplication. Now notice in this example we have addition. So that tells you that it's going to be one of those 3 addition properties. So 3 plus, in parentheses we have 8 plus 9, is the same as 3 plus, question mark, plus 9. Well, the only number that we can see in order for these to be equal that's missing is the 8. And that is from the associative property of addition. Okay, we just looked at this one actually. Question mark times 6 equals 0. So what number does the question mark have to be so that the whole thing equals 0? Well, we know that 0 is the only thing that will make that 0. And that is the multiplication property of 0. That's what it means. 6 times 8 or 8 times, that's right, it's 6. And this is because of our commutative property of multiplication. 8 times what will give you 8? Well, 8 times 1 is the only number, and that, remember, is the multiplicative identity. Negative 4 plus what will give you 0? So if I have negative 4 and I want to get to 0, I have to add 4. So negative 4 plus 4 is 0, and that is the additive inverse property. All right, so we have 3 more to do. 9 times 5 times 7 is the same as if we took 9 times what times 7? Well, the only thing missing is the 5, and that is what we need to have. And that is the associative property of multiplication. Again, there's only addition and multiplication, so look for the sign, and then you can narrow it down to one of the ones that you've learned. Question mark times 1 equals question mark. Well, what's going to make that true? Well, actually, any number makes that true because of how the multiplicative identity works. Any number times 1 is going to give you that number. And last but not least, negative 16 times what will give me 0? And that, of course, is 0. And that's because of the multiplication property of 0. And that's our lesson on the properties of real numbers.